They called it a panel on judicial reform, but what unfolded on that DC stage was nothing short of a political reckoning. When Pam Bondi turned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and said the word unqualified, the air left the room. Cameras caught the moment, but they couldn't capture the weight of what followed. This wasn't just a clash of credentials, it was a battle for what justice really means in America. One woman brought decades of courtroom grit, the other, social media heat and sound bites. But when the dust settled, the audience wasn't cheering noise. They were stunned by truth. If you believe experience still matters, that facts beat fury, and that real leadership can't be faked, this story will hit home. Tap like, hit subscribe, and stay with us, because what Pam Bondi did next left even her critics speechless. It began in Washington, D.C., not in a courtroom, but on a brightly lit stage at the Lincoln Theater, a venue that had once echoed with gospel choirs and presidential speeches. On this day, it held something different. 5 panelists seated behind a long white table at the American Forum on Judicial Reform. The crowd wasn't just full, it was electric. Rows of folding chairs packed with judges, civil rights attorneys, law students, senators, and average Americans who still believed that words spoken under spotlights could change the trajectory of the country. Among them were veterans who had worn the Constitution on their chest, church leaders holding Bibles on their laps, and retirees who had spent decades watching their country bend and buckle under the weight of decisions made in rooms just like this one. In the middle of that stage sat 2 women whose reputations preceded them: Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, sharp as a scalpel and every bit as precise, and Jasmine Crockett, a first-term Congresswoman from Texas, known more for viral clips than courtroom strategy. If Bondi was the embodiment of seasoned legal authority, Crockett represented the new era of political theater, bold, unapologetic, and deeply aware of the camera's gaze. For 10 minutes, the panel had moved cautiously through opening statements. The moderator, a soft-spoken professor from Georgetown, attempted to navigate the volatile waters of criminal justice reform and the ever-blurring line between state and federal oversight. But everyone in that audience knew it was just a matter of time before the calm gave way to confrontation. Pam Bondi spoke first, measured, clear, and unshaken. "We need experience," she said, her voice smooth like glass. "We need grounded legal understanding, not emotionally driven responses. We need the law to lead us, not headlines." Her gaze then slid sideways, deliberate and cold, locking onto Crockett. "Frankly," she said with a pause thick enough to slice through, "I don't think you're qualified to speak on this." There was no gasp, no shouting, just that kind of silence that presses against your skin. A stillness where every breath becomes audible, every heartbeat amplified. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed, the way a surgeon's might before the first incision. Her lips parted, but no words came for a long beat. She sat up straighter, reached for her mic, not to shout, but to lean in. And with a calm so unnervingly still, she asked, "I'm sorry. What exactly do you think makes me unqualified?" The room waited. Pam Bondi, composed as ever, straightened her stack of notes before answering. "I've prosecuted cases that defined public safety in my state. I've sat in strategy sessions that influenced national legislation. I've led with legal precedent, not passion. I didn't come here for theater. This isn't a stage for political outrage." But that's where she miscalculated, because for many in that room, particularly the older crowd who had watched the justice system ebb and flow for decades, Bondi's cool confidence suddenly felt a little too polished, a little too rehearsed. And in contrast, Crockett's quiet intensity wasn't just noticeable, it was magnetic. Jasmine Crockett's hands didn't shake, her tone didn't spike, but what followed was less a rebuttal and more a reckoning. "I've tried over 100 criminal cases in courtrooms that didn't make the evening news," she said. "I've defended the voiceless, the wrongly accused, the forgotten. I've written legislation that's become law, and I've worked with Republicans and Democrats alike to get it done. But if you believe experience only counts when it looks like yours, maybe that's the very reason reform is necessary." No applause, no dramatic music, just stillness. But a new kind, not tension, not confusion. This time, it was focus. The kind of focus that grips a jury when they realize the witness just changed the case. Pam Bondi's expression didn't crack, but her right eye twitched. Her lips tightened just slightly at the corner. It wasn't much, but to those watching closely, it was everything. Crockett wasn't done, not by a mile. "I came here with names," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Mothers who called me at midnight because their sons were locked in cells for crimes they didn't commit. I came here with transcripts, with court records, with the words of children who fear the ones who wear badges." The audience leaned in. And when someone calls me unqualified without even bothering to know my work, my record, my fight, I don't see that as an insult. I see it as fear. Fear that I bring something they can't control. Something rooted in truth, not titles. A murmur from the back, not outrage, not mockery. Just understanding. Because when you've stood beside a 17-year-old boy and argued for his freedom against a system designed to break him, Crockett continued, you don't need a podium to prove your worth. You don't need applause. You just need the truth. And that was the moment. That was when the energy changed. Older viewers, those who had lived through Watergate, who had watched civil rights movements bloom and burn, who had felt the tremble of a nation divided, recognized the shift. It wasn't about political sides anymore. It was about who had lived the weight of justice, who had walked it, and who had simply spoken about it. Pam Bondi tried to pivot. She reached for her next talking point, flipping through a binder of case summaries and federal rulings, but her fingers hesitated, just long enough for people to notice. And Crockett, who hadn't come with slides or summaries, kept talking. "But I'm not surprised," she said, turning her attention to the crowd, not the table. "I've seen this before. I've seen rooms like this one tilt away from voices like mine, and still we speak, still we show up, because we don't answer to tradition. We answer to truth." This wasn't a clapback. It was a cold dismantling. One by one, heads turned from Bondi to Crockett. Eyes sharpened. Minds shifted. People leaned in, not because they agreed, but because they suddenly needed to hear what came next. And if you've ever been told you didn't belong in a room you earned, if you've ever been talked over by someone who hadn't done half your work, then you know exactly what this moment felt like. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about justice reform. It was about being seen. Pam Bondi's silence wasn't surrender, but it was still silence. And in a room built for debate, silence is a kind of defeat. The moderator cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. But the shift had already happened. Crockett had moved from panelist to presence, and Bondi, once the surest voice in the room, was now flipping pages to find her footing. The story wasn't over, but the balance had tipped, and what came next would go far beyond that theater. The silence lingered just long enough to turn anticipation into electricity. Pam Bondi had struck first, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded, she had shifted the room's gravity. And now, even as the moderator fumbled for the next question, the audience's eyes never left Crockett. The energy wasn't chaotic, it was focused. It was the calm before something decisive, something unshakable. Because Crockett wasn't done defending herself, she was just beginning to dismantle a legacy. Pam adjusted the mic in front of her, trying to reset the tone. "Look, we're here to talk about reform," she said, voice firmer, but thinner now. "We can't afford to turn this into personal history hour." Crockett didn't blink. "You made it personal when you questioned if I belonged." The words sliced clean through the air. It was the kind of line that didn't need volume. It needed truth. Crockett leaned in, her voice steady, measured. "Let's talk about qualifications, since that's the standard being set. Because if we're going to hold people accountable, let's hold their records up to the light." Pasaukim, she reached into her folder and pulled out a manila envelope. Not thick, but deliberate. She didn't wave it. She didn't flaunt it. She simply opened it and placed 3 pages in front of her. The audience leaned forward, almost collectively. "In 2014, Crockett began, the Attorney General's office in Florida, filed an amicus brief opposing same-sex marriage. The justification, that it would, quote, cause harm to society's moral fabric. That's not law. That's fear disguised as precedent." Pam shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing. Crockett turned to the next sheet. In 2015, your office chose not to prosecute a single case involving the death of unarmed black men at the hands of police officers, despite mounting evidence, national attention, and protests across the state. Not one case saw trial. But we're here to talk about justice reform. There were audible murmurs now, not cheers, not jeers, just the collective sound of minds catching up to the weight of what was being said. And in 2016, Crockett continued, you accepted a $25,000 campaign donation from the Trump Foundation, and just weeks later, your office declined to pursue the case against Trump University. Was that legal? Maybe. But was it ethical? The moderator tried to interrupt. Let's remember this isn't a trial. No, Crockett said, locking eyes with Bondi. But it is about trust. Bondi straightened. Her voice sharpened. I followed the law, not feelings. Crockett didn't flinch. And I've followed lives. I followed the cries of mothers begging for someone to care. I followed kids who learned that justice was a coin toss, depending on where they lived and what they looked like. Don't talk to me about feelings, as if that disqualifies truth. Someone in the audience clapped, just once, sharp, defiant. Then it stopped. Not because it wasn't shared, but because the moment was too raw, too heavy for applause. Crockett lowered her voice. I know what it looks like when a mother buries her child because no one listened. I know what it feels like to walk into a courtroom where the system expects you to lose. And I know that sometimes the most dangerous thing a black woman can be is qualified. The room froze, a kind of stillness that wasn't about silence. It was about weight. Bondi reached for her notes, visibly shaken now. Her composure hadn't cracked completely, but the veneer had. Crockett leaned back for a moment, not to retreat, but to let the silence breathe. Then she said, with a clarity that felt almost sacred, you don't get to discredit people just because their path looked different from yours. Experience isn't a title. It's a testimony. The moderator, still holding his script like a life raft, tried to steer the panel forward. Let's return to the policy debate. What practical reforms are we discussing? Bondi jumped at the chance. We need structured reform, controlled, researched, lawful. We can't afford chaos disguised as progress. Crockett tilted her head, calm. And who gets to define chaos? You? The same people who defended laws that jailed teenagers for small-time possession while white-collar fraud walked free? The air was thick now, not with drama, but with truth. Bondi's polished phrases were beginning to dull against Crockett's lived clarity, because Crockett wasn't just reciting cases, she was recalling them. I remember a 17-year-old, Crockett said, eyes unfocused, as if staring down the past. He had 2 grams of weed in his pocket, first offense, no priors. The prosecutor wanted 10 years. 10 years. I fought that case for months. I stayed up at night digging through precedents, reading depositions, meeting his grandmother at the church down the block. We won, but barely. And not because the system bent toward mercy, but because we refused to let it crush another life. She looked up. So no, Pam, I didn't rise through endorsements. I didn't walk in with donors and connections. I fought my way into every room I've been in, and I stayed. Pam Bondi sat still, her face unreadable. But her silence now wasn't strategy. It was necessity. The moderator exhaled. Let's take a short break. But the story had already broken wide open. As the panelists stood to step off stage, murmurs swept through the theater like waves. Some were leaning toward Crockett, curious, contemplative. Others watched Bondi with careful, distant eyes. No one spoke to the moderator. Outside the venue, reporters were already checking feeds. Microphones were being unzipped. The world had seen something, and it wasn't just a debate. It was a dividing line between the politics of performance and the gravity of people who had lived the system's failures and still chose to stand. And Crockett? She didn't wait for the cameras. She walked past them, back straight, envelope tucked under one arm. Because she hadn't come to win, she came to witness. The break was supposed to be short, just a few minutes for water, bathroom, reapplication of powder, and composure. But inside the staff hallway behind the stage, it was a different scene entirely. Crockett sat in quiet silence, her hand still resting on that now famous envelope, her posture calm, but her mind sharp. Bondi, a few doors down, was huddled with two of her aides, flipping through briefing sheets and whispered counsel. There was no panic, but there was pressure, and unlike Crockett, Bondi wasn't used to being the one trying to recalibrate. When the panel resumed, the seats had refilled, but something was different now. The air held a hum, not of anticipation, but of judgment. People were already choosing sides in their minds, not based on headlines or hashtags, but based on what they had just seen. Pam Bondi returned to her seat a few seconds late. It didn't go unnoticed. The moderator cleared his throat. Let's return to our topic with civility and substance. I'd like to shift us into actionable solutions for judicial equity moving forward. It was Bondi's turn to answer. She adjusted her mic, tried to steady her voice. Judicial equity must be rooted in objectivity. We can't let emotional bias drive reform. We must trust our institutions. The moment we replace facts with feelings, we lose the foundation of our legal system. She nodded to the moderator, a textbook answer, but the room barely reacted. Then the microphone passed back to Crockett. I agree, she said. Facts over feelings. So let's look at some more facts. Bondi exhaled hard, a subtle sign of bracing. In 2013, Florida had the second highest number of juveniles tried as adults in the country, Crockett continued. During that time, your office, Madam Attorney General, argued against proposals to review sentencing disparities. You called them, quote, a distraction from law and order. She didn't read from a page. She knew the quote. But here's the truth, she went on. Law and order without compassion isn't justice. It's control. A man in the third row nodded, slowly, visibly. Pam leaned forward. You're painting nuance in black and white. These decisions were based on legislative priorities, not personal vendettas. Crockett raised an eyebrow. Legislative priorities. I've sat with parents who lost their kids to those priorities. I've walked out of courtrooms where the child was convicted before the trial began because the system didn't care about nuance. It cared about quotas and optics and who got to say they were tough on crime. The room stirred. Bondi tried again. This isn't a race to see who suffered more. It's about what works. Florida's crime rates fell for reasons far beyond your policy choices. Crockett interrupted. You want to talk about data? Let's talk about how black teens in Florida were 5 times more likely to be charged as adults than white teens for the exact same offense. That happened under your watch. Pam Bondi's jaw tensed. And still, Crockett continued, you came here today and dismissed me with one word, unqualified. A pause, thick, personal. You called me unqualified, she repeated, softer now. Despite my courtroom experience, despite my legislative record, despite the thousands of constituents I've defended and served. Bondi tried to pivot. This panel isn't about resumes. But that's exactly what you made it, Crockett cut in. And here's the part you weren't ready for. I didn't come here to protect my title. I came to protect truth. I came to show that credibility isn't about how many interviews you've done. It's about how many lives you've touched. Now the shift was visible. Heads turned fully toward Crockett. Phones lifted, not just to record, but to capture. Crockett pulled a second envelope from her folder. These are letters, she said. Over 100, from people in my district. People impacted by mandatory minimums, cash bail, clerical delays, letters from single mothers, from public school teachers, from pastors, people you'd never see on Fox or CNN, but they live the consequences of policy every day. She slid the envelope across the table, not to Bondi, to the moderator. I'm not here for theater, she said. I'm here for them. It was quiet again, but not still. The room had tilted completely. Pam Bondi sat straighter, tried one last pivot. I served my state with integrity. I defended the law to the best of my ability, and I won elections because people believed in what I stood for. Crockett nodded. And I believe that you believed that, but defending a system doesn't make it just, and being elected doesn't make you right. She paused. It just means you were louder. Until now. That line didn't need applause, but it got one. The crowd didn't erupt. It rose. The sound wasn't wild. It was weighty. Slow claps from the back. Respectful nods from older attendees. Even the moderator seemed momentarily unsure what to do. Crockett sat back, not smug, composed. Pam Bondi looked down. She didn't speak again. And just like that, the conversation had been rewritten, not by who shouted loudest, but by who stood longest. The applause faded, not with haste, but with reverence. People didn't just clap, they absorbed. Crockett had spoken not just with intellect, but with lived conviction. And when the panel concluded minutes later, the moderator's final words were lost beneath the echo of what had already been said. Bondi exited first, flanked by staff, her lips pressed into a measured smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Crockett waited. She gathered her folders with care, as though each page still carried the weight of someone else's story. Outside the theater, the air had changed. Reporters clustered near the barricades, phones already lit, live streams running. "Congresswoman Crockett, any comment on Bondi's remarks?" one shouted. "Do you think she owes you an apology?" another pressed. Crockett kept walking. She didn't dismiss them, but she didn't feed them either. "I said what I needed to say," she offered softly. "And I said it for the people who've been waiting for someone to say it." The clip of the panel hit social media within minutes. On Instagram, it was clipped to Crockett's calm takedown of the word unqualified. On TikTok, it was stitched with reactions from young women mouthing along with her words, eyes wide, fists clenched in solidarity. On X, formerly Twitter, it trended under hashtags like "Xiaoxiqiao, she brought receipts," and "qualified" and "ready." By midnight, the video had over 2.3 million views. But Crockett didn't watch it. She turned her phone on silent that night and placed it face down on her kitchen table. She made tea, put on old jazz, and sat quietly in the dark of her apartment, lit only by the stove light. Because for her, the win wasn't going viral. It was being heard. And being heard didn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it just needed a moment that refused to be ignored. Meanwhile, the internet debated with the fury only truth can ignite. Pundits on conservative networks accused her of grandstanding. Some dismissed her as emotional. But older viewers, especially those who'd worked in law, education, and civil service, watched the clip twice, then again, and again. Not because they doubted her, but because they recognized her. They had been her, dismissed in meetings, overlooked on committees, told they weren't experienced enough by people who had never done the work. And then came the letters, thousands of them, emails, handwritten notes, voicemails left at odd hours, from teachers in Des Moines, from retired attorneys in Atlanta, from church deacons in Ohio, from single mothers in Newark. "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised mine," one read. "You carried us in that room," said another, and the one Crockett printed and taped inside her desk drawer. "Thank you for saying what my daughter needed to hear, because I couldn't find the words." Pam Bondi stayed quiet for 4 days. When she finally addressed the panel, it was through a brief statement posted online. "I respect all perspectives in the pursuit of justice," it read. "We must remain focused on solutions." There was no mention of the word unqualified, no reflection, no acknowledgement, just enough distance to stay composed, and just enough omission to keep the wound raw. But the silence spoke louder than denial. Crockett, however, had no desire for a victory lap. Instead, she returned to Texas the next morning. No press conferences, no staged moments, just her and a staff car heading west to a community meeting in Fort Worth. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a tray of store-bought cookies, and a room full of people who looked her in the eye and said, "We saw it." That night, she took the mic in a rec center gym and said something no headline would print. When someone tells you that you don't belong, don't argue. Just stay long enough to show them why you do. A woman in the second row clapped, then a man near the back, then the rest. No roar, just recognition. She spoke about the panel, not the drama, but the purpose. She talked about policy, about people, about the quiet kind of courage, the kind that doesn't come with applause. "We don't need heroes," she said. "We need listeners. We need fighters who can whisper just as well as they can roar." That, and the room, filled with older voters, grandparents, retired officers, and pastors, nodded, not because they were told to, but because they believed it, because they saw something that night in D.C. that made them believe, maybe for the first time in a long while, that someone in office still fought like she remembered who sent her there. It was a week later when Jasmine Crockett stepped into the small auditorium of Langston High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No stage lights, no panels, no podiums, just a microphone on a wheeled stand and a room full of students who didn't yet know they were about to witness something unforgettable. She hadn't come with a team of advisors or an entourage of photographers. She hadn't even told the media she was coming. The invitation had come from a retired civics teacher, a man who had once taught her law mentor and wanted today's kids to hear something real. She walked in wearing jeans and a blazer, a coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. She looked more like a mentor than a politician. The students, most of them slouched in plastic chairs, were half listening at first. Some fiddled with their phones. Others whispered about the viral video they'd seen earlier in the week, the one where a woman called out a former attorney general and made her freeze on live television. They didn't realize that same woman now stood in front of them. "Let me save you the Google search," Crockett said, tapping the mic gently. "Yes, I'm the one from the video." That got their attention. Heads turned, phones dropped into laps, and just like that, the room was hers. "I'm not here to talk about politics today," she continued. "I'm here to talk about moments, and what we do when one finds us." She told them about the panel, about the word unqualified, about what it means when someone in power tries to define your worth by their standards. "It wasn't the insult that stunned me," she said. "It was how many people in that room, and beyond, had heard it before, felt it, swallowed it." She paused. "I didn't answer to defend myself. I answered because I had the mic. And sometimes, the mic isn't a privilege, it's a responsibility." One girl in the front row nodded slowly. Another boy in the back, who hadn't looked up once until now, suddenly leaned forward. Crockett opened her folder and pulled out one of the letters she had received. "My granddaughter is studying criminal justice," she read aloud. She saw the clip, and for the first time, she believed there was a place for her in that world. She closed the folder and held it to her chest. "That's what I'll remember most," she said. "Not the trending hashtags, not the applause, but that one sentence." When she stepped off the small riser, students came forward, not for selfies, but for handshakes, for questions, for a moment to say thank you. And in that exchange, something shifted. Outside, the air was brisk. The school bell rang. Crockett walked across the cracked pavement toward her car, the voices of teenagers still echoing behind her. She didn't need a camera crew. She had carried something more lasting than a soundbite: presence. That evening, she visited her grandmother's nursing home in Fort Worth. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper and the soft hum of daytime television. Her grandmother, once a public school teacher in the segregated South, sat in a recliner near the window. She smiled when Crockett entered. "You shook them," she said, eyes bright. Crockett knelt beside her. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes that's the heaviest thing you can carry," her grandmother replied, "but you carried it well." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands. At that same hour, in cities across America, the conversation was still alive. A church in Birmingham held a discussion on faith and politics, using a transcript of the panel as their starting point. A senior citizens group in Indiana debated judicial reform with renewed fire. A women's leadership circle in Kansas printed Crockett's quotes and pasted them across their meeting room wall. Back in Washington, Bondi's team quietly scrubbed her calendar. Appearances were postponed, statements were reevaluated. And though she still had her supporters, something had changed. Her silence had left a void, and Crockett's words had filled it, not with noise, but with meaning. Days later, a young woman in Georgia sent Crockett a voice message. "I didn't know anyone in Congress knew what it felt like to be told they weren't enough. You made me feel like maybe I still am." Crockett listened to it twice, then forwarded it to her mother with a single line. "This is why." The story didn't end in that theater in D.C. It didn't even end when the camera lights shut off. It lived on in living rooms, in Sunday sermons, in classrooms and community centers, in coffee shops and kitchen tables. It lived on because it reminded people, especially older Americans, those who had seen history but rarely been heard by it, that truth doesn't need permission to speak. It just needs someone willing to carry it. and Jasmine Crockett. She didn't win because she went viral. She won because, when the time came, she didn't just speak, she stood. If this story moved you, if you believe in voices that rise above politics, in truth that stands tall without shouting, then this is the community for you. Subscribe now to our channel to get more stories that restore faith in justice, in people, and in what it means to lead with conviction. Drop a comment below. Do you think Crockett handled the moment right? Would you have stayed silent or stood up? Like, share, and let your voice be heard, because this isn't just our story. It's yours too.